My name's Marisa Fenwick. I'm 26, and I want to start with the first thing I actually remember clearly after waking up, because it wasn't the beeping machines and it wasn't the fluorescent lights. It was a nurse named Odalis, sitting beside my bed, holding my hand, telling me gently that I'd been unconscious for 9 days. 9 days. I remember trying to process that number, my brain still foggy, still catching up to a version of time that had simply skipped forward without me in it. "Your family?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper, throat raw from the ventilator tube that had only recently come out. "Are they here?" Odalis hesitated, just slightly, in a way that told me something before she even answered. "Your brother came by once. Briefly, a few days ago," she said carefully. "I haven't seen your parents yet." I sat with that for a long moment, staring at the ceiling tiles, trying to understand how 9 days of my life could disappear, how a car accident serious enough to put me in a coma could happen, and my own parents still hadn't shown up. I found out why about an hour later, when my brother Desmond finally walked through the door, looking exhausted, looking like he'd been avoiding this exact conversation. "Where are Mom and Dad?" I asked, before he'd even fully sat down. He hesitated. "They've been really busy," he said. "Preston had regionals last week, the championship game. They didn't want to miss it." I stared at him, waiting for the rest of the explanation, some clarification that would make that sentence make actual sense. It never came. "My brother had a game," I repeated slowly. "I was in a coma for 9 days, and they were at a basketball game." "Okay, let me back up, because you need the whole picture first, or that moment isn't going to land the way it needs to. I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the middle child of 3. My older brother Desmond is 31 now. My younger brother Preston is 19, still in college on a basketball scholarship that our entire family had organized itself around for years by that point. I want to be honest about something right away, because it matters for understanding everything that follows. My family's dynamic had always tilted heavily toward Preston, in a way that went beyond normal parental pride in a talented kid's achievements. My parents, Harlan and Wanda Fenwick, had structured huge portions of their lives, financially and emotionally, around Preston's basketball career, treating it less like a hobby their son happened to excel at, and more like the central organizing principle of our entire family's existence. Desmond and I had both grown used to this over the years, in different ways. Desmond had mostly checked out emotionally from the family dynamic by his mid-20s, maintaining polite distance without much active conflict. I'd tried harder, for longer, to stay engaged, to keep showing up for family events even when it felt like Preston's schedule always took precedence over anything happening in my own life or Desmond's. I worked as an occupational therapist in Tulsa, a career I genuinely loved. Stable, meaningful work that never once got mentioned at family gatherings, with anything close to the enthusiasm reserved for Preston's latest game stats. The accident happened on a Thursday evening. I was driving home from a late shift at the rehab clinic where I worked, and a truck ran a red light at an intersection I'd driven through 1,000 times before, T-boning my car on the driver's side. I don't remember the actual impact. I don't remember much of anything from that night at all, honestly, just fragments, flashing lights, someone's voice telling me to stay awake, and then nothing, until I woke up 9 days later, with Odalis holding my hand. The injuries were serious. Traumatic brain injury, several broken ribs, a collapsed lung, internal bleeding that required emergency surgery within hours of the crash. My doctors told me later, once I was more coherent, that the first 72 hours had been genuinely uncertain, that there'd been real conversations happening about whether I'd wake up at all, let alone recover meaningfully if I did. Desmond had been the one who got the initial call from the hospital, listed as my emergency contact since I'd updated it a couple years earlier, during a period when I was living closer to him than to my parents. He'd rushed to the hospital immediately, stayed through that first terrifying night, and had called our parents right away to let them know what had happened. I found out the actual details of that phone call much later, pieced together slowly through conversations with Desmond over the following weeks, because in the moment, still recovering, still processing the sheer disorientation of losing 9 days of my life, I wasn't in any state to interrogate the full timeline properly. According to Desmond, our mother had answered that first call, and when he explained the severity of the situation, my TBI, the internal bleeding, the very real possibility that I might not survive. Her first question, almost reflexively, had been about Preston's schedule. She asked if this was going to interfere with driving up for regionals that weekend, Desmond told me. I remember just being completely stunned, standing in that hospital hallway, hearing her ask about a basketball game while I was trying to explain that you might die. My father, apparently, had gotten on the phone shortly after, expressed some concern, said they'd try to figure out logistics, but ultimately, over the following days, as my condition stabilized into a coma rather than immediate death, the decision solidified. Preston's regional championship game was that Saturday, 3 days after my accident. It was, according to what my parents apparently told Desmond during a follow-up call, the biggest game of his college career so far, an opportunity they didn't want to miss, especially since, as they framed it, I was stable now, in a coma but not actively dying, which apparently, in their calculation, meant the emergency had passed enough to justify prioritizing Preston's game instead. They went to that game. Then, according to Desmond, they'd stayed the following week for some additional recruiting events connected to Preston's team, treating the entire trip as a kind of extended basketball-focused excursion, rather than returning promptly once the game itself concluded. By the time I actually woke up, 9 days after the accident, they still hadn't come to the hospital at all. Not once. Not for a single hour, during 9 days when I was, according to my doctors, genuinely at risk of not surviving, or of surviving with severe, permanent brain damage. I want to walk you through what those first several days of consciousness actually felt like, because I think it matters for understanding the full weight of what my parents' absence actually meant. Beyond just the abstract unfairness of the situation, I was disoriented, terrified, in significant physical pain, trying to relearn basic things like how to hold a spoon steady enough to eat, dealing with memory gaps that made even simple conversations exhausting and confusing. Desmond was there as much as his own job allowed, but he had his own life to manage too, and there were long stretches, particularly overnight, when I was essentially alone, processing the trauma of nearly dying, with no family member physically present at all. My parents finally arrived at the hospital 11 days after the accident, 2 days after I'd regained consciousness, having apparently finished whatever additional basketball-related activities had extended their trip beyond the actual game itself. I remember watching them walk into my hospital room, my mother's face doing something complicated, somewhere between relief and, I think, a kind of performative concern that felt disconnected from anything genuine. "Oh, thank God you're awake," she said, moving toward my bed. "We came as soon as we could." I stared at her for a long moment, processing that sentence against everything Desmond had already told me about the actual timeline. "As soon as you could," I repeated slowly. "I was told you were at Preston's game, and then some recruiting events. For a week." Her face shifted, something defensive flickering across it. "Marisa, you were stable," she said. "The doctors said you were stable. We didn't think there was anything more we could actually do by being physically present, and Preston needed us there for such a huge moment in his career." "I was in a coma," I said, my voice coming out flatter and more exhausted than angry, though the anger was definitely there, sitting underneath the surface. "You didn't know if I was going to wake up at all, and you decided a basketball game mattered more than being here." My father, standing slightly behind her, tried a different angle. "We called every day to check on your condition," he said. "The nurses kept us updated. We weren't ignoring the situation, Marisa. We just made a judgment call about what actually made sense given the circumstances." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something crystallize inside me that had been building, honestly, for years, long before this specific accident, but that this particular situation had finally, undeniably confirmed beyond any possibility of my usual instinct to make excuses for them. I didn't say much more during that visit. I was still physically exhausted, still processing everything, and I didn't have the energy, in that moment, to fully articulate everything I was actually feeling. But something had shifted permanently in how I understood my place in that family, a clarity that, once it arrived, didn't seem inclined to fade the way earlier disappointments sometimes had. My recovery took months. Physical therapy for the rib injuries and collapsed lung, ongoing cognitive rehabilitation for the traumatic brain injury, which left me with some lingering memory issues and difficulty concentrating that took real time and effort to work through. Throughout that entire recovery process, my parents' involvement remained minimal: occasional phone calls, a couple of brief visits scattered across weeks, always somehow secondary to whatever was happening with Preston's ongoing basketball season. Desmond, by contrast, showed up consistently, driving me to appointments when I still couldn't drive myself, helping me manage the practical logistics of rebuilding a life that had been completely upended in ways our parents simply never made time for. About 6 weeks into my recovery, once I was home from the hospital and working through outpatient rehabilitation, I finally had the clarity and the energy to actually sit with everything that had happened and to decide what I wanted to do about it. I want to be honest that my first instinct wasn't some dramatic plan for confrontation. It was something quieter, more internal, a recognition that I needed to fundamentally reassess what kind of relationship I actually wanted, or could reasonably expect, with parents who had demonstrated, in the starkest possible terms, exactly where I ranked in their priorities. I started seeing a therapist specifically to work through the trauma of the accident itself, and inevitably, the sessions ended up addressing the deeper, longer-standing family dynamics that the accident had simply brought into sharper, undeniable focus. My therapist, a thoughtful woman named Dr. Okafor, helped me understand something that, looking back, I probably already knew on some level, but hadn't fully let myself accept. This wasn't really about one bad decision during a crisis, she told me during one session. Based on everything you're describing, this sounds like a pattern that's been building your entire life, and the accident simply made that pattern impossible to rationalize away any further. She was right, and once I let myself actually sit with that truth, a lot of other things started making sense too. Years of smaller moments where Preston's schedule, Preston's needs, Preston's achievements had consistently taken precedence over anything happening in my life or Desmond's. Moments I'd always found some way to explain or minimize, because acknowledging the full pattern felt too painful to confront directly. About 4 months after the accident, once I'd recovered enough physically and emotionally to actually have a clear, structured conversation, rather than just reacting in the moment, I decided to write my parents a letter, rather than trying to have this conversation verbally, where I knew from experience they'd find ways to deflect and reframe things in real time before I could fully articulate what I actually needed to say. I want to share some of what I wrote, because I think it captures something important about how I'd come to understand the situation by that point. I told them that I understood Preston's basketball career mattered to them, and that I wasn't asking them to stop supporting him or attending his games going forward. What I told them, plainly, was that I needed them to understand exactly what their choice during my accident had actually communicated to me, not through any single dramatic statement, but through the simple, undeniable fact of their absence during 9 days when I was fighting for my life, followed by their continued distance during my recovery, all while Preston's basketball season continued receiving their full attention and presence. I told them that I'd spent my entire life making excuses for this pattern, telling myself it wasn't really about favoritism, that there were reasonable explanations for why Preston's needs always seemed to take precedence. But nearly dying, and watching my own parents choose a basketball game over being present for that, had made it impossible for me to keep making those excuses any longer. I told them I needed real distance from them going forward, not necessarily permanent estrangement, but a significant step back from the level of involvement and expectation that had previously characterized our relationship, until they could genuinely demonstrate, through actions rather than just apologetic words, that I actually mattered to them as much as Preston did. I sent that letter, and then I waited, honestly uncertain what kind of response, if any, I'd actually receive. My mother called about a week later, and the conversation that followed was difficult, filled with a lot of defensive justification initially, attempts to explain away the decision as a reasonable judgment call rather than the clear demonstration of misplaced priorities that it actually represented. "We love you just as much as we love Preston," she insisted at one point. "This wasn't about loving you less, Marissa. We just made a specific decision about a specific situation. You made a decision that I could survive without you there," I said, "while Preston apparently couldn't survive without you at a basketball game. I need you to actually sit with what that comparison reveals, rather than just insisting it doesn't mean what it obviously means. That conversation didn't resolve everything, not by any measure. But it did open something, a crack in the wall of justification my parents had been maintaining, that allowed for slightly more honest conversation over the following months than we'd had in years prior. I want to walk you through what actually changed, gradually, over the year following the accident, because I think the slow, uneven nature of that change matters more than any single dramatic turning point would. My father, surprisingly, seemed to internalize the situation more directly than my mother initially did. About 2 months after that first difficult phone call, he reached out separately, asking if we could meet for coffee, just the two of us, away from my mother's tendency to steer conversations back toward justification and deflection. "I've been thinking about what you wrote," he told me, sitting across from me in a quiet coffee shop, looking genuinely uncomfortable in a way I hadn't seen from him often growing up. "I keep coming back to the actual moment your mother asked about Preston's game, right after Desmond told us you might not survive. I think about how quickly that became the actual question on the table, rather than just rushing to be with you immediately, figuring out the game later. I don't have a good explanation for that, Marisa. I think we just got so used to organizing everything around Preston that it became almost automatic, without either of us really examining what that meant for you and Desmond." That conversation meant a great deal to me, honestly, more than any of the earlier, more defensive exchanges with my mother had. It wasn't a complete fix, not by any means, but it represented something my mother's responses hadn't yet managed, genuine reflection rather than immediate justification. My mother's own shift came more slowly, over several months, through a combination of continued distance from me, which I think genuinely unsettled her in ways she hadn't expected, and, eventually, some of her own therapy, which my father apparently encouraged her toward once he'd started processing his own role in the family dynamic more honestly. About 8 months after the accident, she called me, her voice different than I'd heard it in any of our previous conversations, something closer to genuine vulnerability rather than defensive justification. "I've been in therapy," she told me, "working through some things about how I grew up. Honestly, about how achievement was always the thing that got attention and love in my own family, and I think I recreated that same pattern without ever really examining it, prioritizing Preston's achievements the same way my own parents prioritized whichever of us kids was excelling at something specific at any given time. That explanation didn't erase what had happened, didn't undo those 9 days I'd spent unconscious with no parent present, or the following weeks of minimal support during a genuinely terrifying recovery. But it did represent something real, an actual attempt at understanding rather than simply insisting the situation hadn't meant what it clearly meant. Preston, for his part, found out about the full situation gradually, mostly through conversations with Desmond, rather than directly from me, since I wasn't particularly inclined, in those early months, to manage his feelings about a situation that had already cost me so much in terms of managing everyone else's comfort with the truth. He reached out to me himself, eventually, about 6 months after the accident, clearly having processed the situation on his own terms. "I had no idea, at the time, how bad your accident actually was," he told me. "Mom and Dad kind of framed it, in the moment, like you were stable and recovering, nothing that required them to change their plans. I didn't find out until way later how serious it actually was, that you were in an actual coma, that there was real concern about whether you'd survive. Would it have changed anything if you had known?" I asked, genuinely curious about his answer. He was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, I don't know," he said. "I think I probably would have wanted them there with you if I'd understood the full severity, but I also think, looking back, I got used to being the center of everyone's attention in a way that probably made it easier for them to justify choices like that, without me ever really questioning it." That honesty meant something to me, actually, hearing him acknowledge his own complicated position in the family dynamic, rather than either defending our parents' choice outright or performing excessive guilt he didn't necessarily feel in a genuine way. It's been about 18 months now since the accident. My physical recovery is largely complete, though I still deal with some lingering cognitive effects from the traumatic brain injury, manageable but present. A permanent reminder of just how close that night actually came to ending very differently. My relationship with my parents is fundamentally different now than it was before, more honest in some ways, more distant in others. A recalibration that I think reflects a more accurate understanding of our actual family dynamics, rather than the more comfortable, if less truthful, version we'd all been operating under previously. My father and I have grown closer, genuinely, through his willingness to sit with the discomfort of what happened, rather than deflecting it. My mother and I are still working through things, more slowly, though her therapy seems to be creating real, if gradual, shifts in how she approaches family dynamics more broadly. Desmond and I are closer than we've ever been, honestly, bonded through both his consistent presence during my recovery and our shared, if differently processed, understanding of our family's long-standing patterns. Preston and I talk more now, too, in ways that feel more genuine than our relationship growing up, when the gap in how our parents treated us made real closeness difficult to build authentically. Sometimes I think about that hospital room, waking up after 9 days, asking Odalise if my family was there, watching her hesitate before answering. I think about how close that entire situation came to just being absorbed the way so many earlier moments of misplaced priority had been absorbed throughout my life, explained away, minimized, folded into whatever narrative made it easiest for everyone to keep functioning as a family without confronting the actual pattern underneath. What actually stopped that, in the end, wasn't some dramatic confrontation or ultimatum. It was simply the accident itself being severe enough, undeniable enough, that no amount of reasonable-sounding justification could fully explain away a choice that's stark. Parents choosing a basketball game over their own daughter's potential death, in terms clear enough that even they, eventually, had to actually sit with what that choice revealed about where I'd always genuinely ranked in their priorities. I don't know if I'll ever fully trust that ranking has permanently shifted. Some patterns, once you see them clearly enough, leave a kind of permanent wariness behind, even after genuine efforts at change. But I do know that I finally stopped making excuses for something that never should have required excusing in the first place, and that clarity, however painfully it arrived, has been worth more to me than any version of comfortable denial ever was. That's really the whole story, when I sit back and think about it honestly. Not some dramatic courtroom battle, no screaming confrontation caught on camera. Just 9 days of unconsciousness, a basketball game that apparently mattered more than my survival, and a slow, difficult process of finally understanding exactly where I stood in my own family, once the excuses simply ran out of room to hide the truth any longer.